Oh, hello there. Yes, well, those weeks of my afternoon naps are soon going to be coming to an end. Boo and hiss. Boo and hiss indeed, yes. Anyway, today we're once again going to be probably slaying off the media because, God, they give us a distorted view of reality, and it's no wonder why so many people get very, very confused as to, for example, what the rich are up to, because oddly the rich do own the media, and they have a very, 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 very hands-off approach, obviously, or they accept magically a vested interest in telling us things that aren't necessarily, strictly speaking, true. And with the spectre of a Stalinist-style Labour tax raid, whatever Stalinist means, because I don't think Stalin was particularly keen on tax, but that's just me knowing things. Anyway, yeah, we come with the inevitable newspaper headlines, as of yesterday morning, about average people and the middle classes being hammered. I mean, the newspapers never really seem to care when non-average people are hammered, or the disabled, or whatever it might be, because to hell with it, they're going to die anyway, aren't they? And they do have an aspect of useless mouths about them, and increasingly the working class in this country are treated that way, but that's another story. So what they will tend to come out with is this notion that any form of taxation on the wealthy, and by that I would mean the top 10%, and in particular the top 5%, and in particular the top 1%, and in particular the top 0.1%, is presented as something dreadful that might be visited upon an average person in an average home, which it isn't going to be. It just isn't going to be. So you get these dreadful stories about how average people with their average house will have an average tax bill, but the use of average very often is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Whenever there are disputes, you can see this as well. During the train workers' strike, not ASLEF, not the train drivers, but the train workers' strike with Mitt Lynch, organisations like GB News will forever go on about median pay, the middle bit, right, okay? And it's basically assuming that you don't know statistics. Now, when we talk about an average, we mean the mean. The mean, yes, you may dimly recall that from when you were 15. Probably not, actually. A lot of people don't know it. Anyway, the mean is when you add all the bits up together and you divide by how many there are. So, for example, just as a classic example here, if you were to get a group of 50 people on a bus who were just average people going to work, there's a very good chance that their average wage, adding all the yearly wages of the people on the bus and dividing by 50, say, would be about, let's say, 30k a year. That would be sensible, right? Okay. But if somebody was to get on that bus who earned £4.5 million a year, then suddenly that one extra person would mean that the average pay, in this case the mean, would really, really be high. So suddenly with that person sitting on the bus, say the director of Stagecoach, then you'd end up with an average rate of pay which would be like £250,000 a year, which is patently absurd. So what the newspapers, when they're reporting this stuff, tend to do is, as I say, do a sleight of hand. Now, your median is your middle, okay, and we'll come back to that in terms of actual pay and actually what's going on. But because the newspapers do this, because they're terrified of the notion that their proprietors might have to pay more tax, right? So they'll try and persuade you that you are an average person and that you're going to get hammered. Now, the average people in this country, of course, have been hammered with tax. But if you look at what average pay is in this country, and it tends to use a number of different figures, we tend to arrive at round about £35,000 a year. However, it does tend to disguise, in that sense, what exactly being rich is, because average people, like me, and probably like you as well, in real terms have seen our pay decrease quite a bit. Certainly in the way that things were going. If you look at post-war Britain, especially in the 50s, 60s, and to a large extent the 1970s, even to a certain extent in the 80s, then people people's wages kept pace with inflation. But what happened post-2008, with our glorious government in particular, was that suddenly that didn't happen. Now, the people at the top, the actual people at the top, the top 10%, top 1%, top 0.1%, saw their earnings grow. In the case of the top 1%, enormously. They're the people that own the media and that will tell you that you're average when in fact it's debatable if you are. Yeah? So there was this huge dip that happened in the mid-teens whereby I'm sure you remember the headlines that various people's wages were stagnant and to an extent that hadn't been seen since the Napoleonic Wars, which is something you don't hear about anymore. So whenever we hear dreadful things, imagine all that tax pay that's going to the doctors, well, that's just restoring a bit of the pay that they've lost. It's the same with the teachers. One of the questions that's never asked when you get questions about pay is, I'd love to see this with a Julia Hartley-Brewer or a Patrick Christie's or somebody, is to say, well, how poor do you want people to be? If you expect people to be poorer every year, there will come a time where they will tell you with a pitchfork and a torch exactly where to shove it. So, yeah, there are better representations of exactly what's going on. You may remember that poor sucker on BBC's Question Time, who was on 80k, who was thinking that he was just basically on average pay, and he wasn't. But at the same extent, he wasn't rich either. This is the thing, you can be on 100k in the UK and just probably being okay. If you've got a two-person household where both people are on about 50k, you'll probably be reasonably comfortable. If you've got a one-person household that's on 50k, you may well be okay. If you've got a one or two person household where each of those people earns 15k a year, you're really going to struggle. That's what average is. So we need to think about these things in better ways, and median to a certain extent does do it, but it does give you a very distorted picture of exactly how rich the rich are, because by God, they are rich. And my favourite representation is this one of the good old USA, which gives you an idea of wealth, which the Labour Party, if they're sensible, will actually have a bit of a look at, because I don't think it's fair that people in wheelchairs should pay more. Just me being a fussy, if you like, and not that much of a eugenicist. But yeah, this is a diagram that will show you exactly where we are, and this is quite old now, in terms of what people actually own. The 40% of people are the red dots. That's you and me and everyone else who's average. And we're not going to end up being hit particularly by inheritance tax on our large portfolio of properties in London. Still, that's just reality, I suppose. Do have a lovely Thursday, and get those afternoon naps in if you can.